behind the marble walls of the Vatican, where the air should smell of incense and divinity, there once lingered a different scent, the metallic scent of an approaching end and the cloying perfume of a forbidden playground. Most people think of the papacy as a holy lineage, an unbroken chain of spiritual custodians stretching back to the rock on which Christ built his church. But for one man, the throne of St. Peter wasn't a spiritual duty. It was a machinery of power, engineered with cold precision, designed to facilitate the most exquisite suffering and depravity in human history. We often look at history through sanitized legends. We are taught about the great builders, the patrons of art, the men who commissioned cathedrals and funded the brushes of immortal painters. But we ignore the screaming forests of the dead left in their wake. We admire the ceiling and never ask what was buried in the foundations. In the next 17 minutes, we are stripping away the Hollywood makeup to find the real Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, like the incorruptible Robespierre who became an architect of terror, or King Leopold who used humanitarianism as a mask for a regime that cost millions of lives. This sinister Pope discovered something that every tyrant before and after him has understood in their marrow: that fear is stronger than any army, and that a man who controls the language of God controls everything beneath God's sky. You are going to discover the psychological architecture of a man who turned the most powerful institution on earth into a republic of pirates, where everything was predictable because every soul had a price. We're going deep into the shadows of the Renaissance to uncover the unsanitized reality of the Banquet of Chestnuts, the weaponized rituals of the Borgia poison, and why, for 500 years, we have participated, willingly and without much examination, in the rehabilitation of a monster. To understand the monster, you have to understand the world that created him. The late 1400s was a period of absolute chaos. Italy was not a nation. It was a wound, a fractured landscape of competing city-states, feudal armies, and papal territories locked in a permanent bleeding war of attrition. Florence trembled under the Medicis. Milan answered to the Sforzas. Naples and Rome were perpetually circling each other like injured dogs, each waiting for the other to show weakness. Power was not inherited here. It was seized. And the moment you stopped seizing it, someone else's knife was already moving through the air toward your back. This was the ecosystem into which Rodrigo Borgia was born. Not in Rome, not even in Italy, but in Játiva, in the Kingdom of Valencia, in the year 1431. He arrived in Rome as a young man riding the coattails of his uncle, Cardinal Alfonso de Borja, who would himself become Pope Calixtus III. Even then, Rodrigo understood something that most ambitious men in the church refused to admit to themselves: that the Vatican was not a house of God. It was a court, and courts run on the same ancient fuel: loyalty, leverage, and the threat of what happens when you withhold either. Rodrigo Borgia understood the power of a brand centuries before the concept existed. He wasn't a man of God. He was a calculated political actor wearing the costume of one. He rose through the ranks not by spiritual merit, not by fasting or prayer or the quiet accumulation of theological wisdom, but by mastering the bureaucracy of the throne. He became vice-chancellor of the church at just 26 years old, a position he would hold for over 3 decades, accumulating wealth, connections, and leverage with the quiet, relentless patience of a spider at the center of an expanding web. Like Edward I using legal codes and administrative records to trap the Scottish nobility, Rodrigo used the church's own legal fiction, its ceremonies, its appointments, its sacred language, to buy his way to the papacy. Think about the audacity of that. In a world where the king's authority was considered a direct extension of divine favor, where the Pope's word was literally the voice of God on earth, Rodrigo simply realized that divinity could be purchased. He didn't want to just lead the church. He wanted to own it on paper first, to make it his instrument, his family business, his inheritance. And in the summer of 1492, the same year Columbus crossed the Atlantic, the same year the medieval world was cracking open at every seam, Rodrigo Borgia walked into the conclave, distributed a quantity of gold and ecclesiastical offices so obscene that contemporary accounts called it the largest bribe in papal history, and emerged as Pope Alexander VI. The mask of holiness was secured, and behind it, the Vatican was transformed. Like the forest of the dead outside Targovist, that avenue of impaled bodies that Vlad III constructed as a psychological weapon against Ottoman armies, Alexander VI's court became a gallery of horror for his enemies and a gilded playground for his desires. The difference was that Vlad operated in the open, in daylight, with the brutal honesty of a man who wanted you to know what he was. Alexander operated behind ceremony, behind candles and incense and the theater of the sacred. His violence wore vestments. The sources tell us that ultimate cruelty equals ultimate power. And Alexander VI reportedly hosted what history has branded the Banquet of Chestnuts, an event so savage beyond ordinary comprehension that medieval chroniclers struggled to record it without visibly flinching. The account comes primarily from Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, whose private diary, the Liber Notarum, reads less like an ecclesiastical record and more like testimony from a man who had looked directly into an abyss and survived. Burchard was not a moralist. He was a bureaucrat. He recorded what he saw the way an accountant records numbers, without drama, without outrage, which makes his account of the October 1499 event all the more devastating. It was a choreographed piece of state theatre, much like the public humiliations favored by King Ferdinand VII, designed not merely for private pleasure, but to demonstrate something, to show that proximity to the Pope was no longer a guarantee of safety, that the sacred space of the Vatican had been reclaimed as his personal domain, where his will was the only law, and the concept of the forbidden had been surgically removed. Imagine being a visiting ambassador. You arrive at the Vatican expecting a holy audience, the solemnity of the papal chambers, the whispered Latin, the candlelight and the ritual weight of the oldest institution in Western civilization. Instead, you find yourself witnessing a scene of protected depravity that exists precisely because the man at its center answers to no one on earth. This wasn't excess. This wasn't weakness. This was a surgical strike against the very idea of moral limits, a demonstration that the most powerful man in Christendom had placed himself entirely beyond them. Alexander VI didn't just rule. He manufactured fear as a product. He used psychological warfare to maintain his grip with a consistency and creativity that put most military commanders to shame, like Qin Shi Huang, who became increasingly haunted by his own mortality and responded by constructing an army of terracotta soldiers to guard him in death. Alexander became obsessed with control, not just of his court, but of the future. The difference was that Qin feared death. Alexander used the threat of it as currency. He allegedly weaponized a poison known as Cantarella, preparation that caught whispers, described as a blend of arsenic and phosphorus, possibly mixed with organic compounds that allowed it to be administered slowly, creating a death that mimicked natural illness and was merely impossible to trace by the medical science of the era. Whether every account of its use is historically verifiable is a question scholars still debate. What is not debated is the effect of its reputation. It was systematic, clinical, much like the bureaucracy of evil deployed by King Leopold. Not the explosion of a rage, but the code mechanism of a decision made in advance, weeks before the victim sat down to eat. The geometry of power was simple. If a cardinal became too wealthy, if a noble became a liability, if an ally knew too much or a rival knew too little, they were invited to dinner at which the Pope was the most gracious of hosts, and within hours, their pulse would be fluttering in their neck like a moth trapped behind glass. The wealthy died, their estates reverted, their positions were redistributed, and the men watching understood, viscerally in the part of the brain that predates language, that this was a system. The Pope was not merely corrupt, he was efficient. Was he a visionary who paved the way for a unified Italy? Or a man whose brilliance was swallowed by his own shadow? The question is not rhetorical. It is genuinely uncomfortable because the answer might be both. Like the incorruptible Robespierre, Alexander believed that the ends, the survival and supremacy of his family bloodline justified any monstrous means. He commissioned great art. He consolidated territories that would eventually become the geopolitical bones of a modern state. The Vatican, under Alexander, was architecturally transformed. Scholars worked in its libraries, painters climbed its scaffolding, and beneath all of it, a system of terror ran like a current through the stone. Why does a man turn into such a predator? The psychological literature on unchecked authority is consistent. Power does not corrupt good men. It reveals what was already there and removes the structures that once contained it. Like Vlad III, or the first emperor of China, Alexander's motivations were rooted in a particular wound. The wound of the outsider, a Spaniard in Rome. Man whose legitimacy was always one whispered insult away from being challenged. He saw his children, Cesare and Lucrezia, not as people to be shielded from the machinery of power, but as the machinery's most valuable components. He forced Lucrezia into multiple marriages before she was old enough to fully understand what marriage meant. Her body was property, something that could be traded, repositioned, sold into a new alliance the moment the previous alliance ceased to be useful. Her first marriage was annulled when it lost its political function. Her second ended in her husband's murder, a killing that most historians believe Cesare ordered and Alexander permitted. She was not a simple victim. She was a survivor, and the distinction matters. She adapted. She learned. She became, in her own way, formidable. But the cost of that survival was a childhood that ended before it began, inside a family where love and leverage were indistinguishable from each other. Cesare Borgia became the apex predator of Italy, a man so creatively ruthless that even hardened condottieri, men who had spent their lives selling violence to the highest bidder, fled at the shadow of his approaching army. Niccolo Machiavelli watched Cesare operate and wrote it all down. The book we know as The Prince is, in large part, a portrait of Cesare, a study of a man who had been raised inside a machine of power and had internalized every one of its lessons without sentiment or hesitation. When Machiavelli describes the ideal ruler as someone who knows when to be the lion and when to be the fox, he is not writing theory, he is writing biography. And the father who built that man deserves to be examined as carefully as the son. In August 1503, the Sinister Pope finally met his end. The circumstances are disputed, debated, and deliberately obscured by time and the interests of those who had every reason to muddy the historical record. Like the first emperor of China, who died on a journey away from the capital, clutching at a life slipping through his fingers like sand, Alexander succumbed to a sudden, violent illness. Fever, vomiting, the rapid darkening of the skin that contemporary observers found deeply and specifically disturbing. The most persistent theory, and the one that carries the darkest irony, is that he was felled by the very poison he had prepared for another man, that the machine he built eventually processed its own engineer. His corpse, by contemporary accounts, was nearly unrecognizable within hours. The face had swollen and blackened, the body bloated so grotesquely that getting it into the coffin required considerable physical force. Whether this was the effect of poison of the malarial fever sweeping Rome that summer, or of both, no one in 1503 wanted to be the person who asked too many questions. The men who might have ordered an investigation were the same men who had spent years living in quiet terror of the answer. Cesare, who had also fallen catastrophically ill that same night at the same dinner table, survived. Barely. He never fully recovered his strength or his political footing. The empire of fear his father had spent decades constructing began to collapse almost immediately, because that is the nature of empires built on fear alone. They are extraordinarily stable, while the source of the fear is alive, and extraordinarily fragile the moment it isn't. The most horrifying truth in this entire investigation isn't the number of victims. It isn't the scale of the forbidden playground, or even the specific mechanics of the violence. It is something quieter and more implicating than any of those things. It is the rehabilitation of monsters. Today, the Borgias are the stars of television series and historical novels. We treat them with the affectionate fascination we reserve for the dangerously glamorous, the way we speak about certain gangsters, certain warlords, certain tyrants whose crimes are far enough in the past to have acquired the comfortable patina of entertainment. We focus on the building projects, the art patronage, the aesthetic magnificence of the Renaissance world they inhabited. We find ways, unconscious, automatic, convenient ways, to excuse the inexcusable because the monster was a patron of the masters, because the terror came wrapped in gold leaf and fresco, because the suffering happened to people whose names we don't know. This is not a medieval problem. It is a human one. We are drawn to power in a way that corrupts our moral accounting. We tell ourselves that understanding is not excusing, and that is true. But there is a point at which fascination slides into rehabilitation, and we have been on the wrong side of that line with the Borgias for a very long time. Alexander VI proved a chilling and permanent detail of history, that with enough trauma, enough isolation, and enough unchecked power, a human being can become more monstrous than any myth we have ever invented to frighten ourselves. He showed us that ultimate power is a house of cards if the man holding it has a damaged soul, and that the more magnificent the architecture around it, the longer it takes for anyone to notice the rot at the center. Rodrigo Borgia was a man who built a throne of gold and called it God's will. He was a brilliant mind that chose, deliberately, consciously, with full understanding of the alternatives, to use its gifts for creating the most exquisite suffering possible. He remains, 5 centuries after his bloated corpse was forced into its coffin, a grim reminder that monsters don't need fangs. They just need power, an institution that asks no questions, and a soul that learned too young that love and leverage are the same thing. The history we think we know is often just a mask for a much darker, more human reality. The marble walls of the Vatican are still standing, the incense still burns, and somewhere in the archives, Burchard's diary is still waiting, patient, precise, and utterly without mercy, for the next person willing to read what it actually says. If this investigative deep dive into the Sinister Pope and the machinery of the Vatican gave you a new perspective on power, hit the subscribe button. I'll see you in the next investigation.